Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Giuliano, and I've had the pleasure of working in self-directed services for a number of years now. Today's session is being offered via WebEx. In the audience today, we have self-directed team members from central and regional offices to assist with your questions, and we will, again, be leaving time at the end to collect that information. Also, as a reminder, at the end of the training today, please take a moment to complete the attestation in the SLMS to complete the training. The first attachment provided through the SLMS has the instructions on how to complete that attestation form. Okay, so an overview of today, we will be talking about veteran fiscal intermediary identified best practices, how we overcome challenges, and identifying the available resources to you throughout the regional office. As previously communicated, all of the fiscal intermediaries in the state are expected to attend all 3 sessions in this refresher series. If you recall, in Module 1, it provided a vast overview related to fiscal intermediary contracts. In review, as an interim solution to address widespread utilization concerns, contract amendments are being initiated by central office for FI providers who are trending to exceed their 5-year contract before 2024. Providers meeting the criteria for this adjustment are being identified by central office, and this activity is the first step in reaching a long-term solution. Once phase 1 is complete, any additional contract amendment requests will be explored, and please reach out to your regional field office if you have any questions related to this process. In Module 2, we review the overarching mechanics related to fiscal intermediary operations at the provider level, and that content was designed to provide a broad review of the FI service, framing the trademarks to keep in mind when establishing your own internal agency policies, procedures, and quality assurance protocols. Today for Module 3, we are brainstorming provider identified best practices. My volume apparently is low, sorry guys. Provider identified best practices, ways in which veteran FIs have successfully overcome routine challenges, and acknowledging the resources available to you as providers. Recommendation number 1, we are discussing onboarding checklists. What would we consider an onboarding checklist? That would be a provider identified shaped checklist to guide the intake conversation prior to contracting with a family for the fiscal intermediary service and ensure that your HCBS waiver provider of record meets standards. So when we are talking with new enrollees, consider creating a checklist that goes over and reviews all of the elements needed as a waiver provider of record. Per the DQY website, beneficiary, the individual being served, has been verified as eligible for OPWDD services, and that can be achieved by having the OPWDD letter of eligibility or comparable proof being something provided to you by the regional office that states the date the individual was made eligible. The level of care and eligibility determination, LCED, those are updated annually by care coordinators. On file, you also need to have a current life plan that is validated and published with authorized signatures. Assigned authorization for service as well, which would come in the form of a request for service authorization from front door, or an NOD-9 through service authorization, the SARF process from care coordination. Another practice that many fiscal intermediaries have found useful is called the Self-Direction Coordinator, or the SDC. The SDC is a non-Medicaid funded staff employed by the fiscal intermediary that liaises between the FI, the circle of support, the support broker, and care manager to ensure service standards are met, contemporaneous files are maintained, and reimbursements are vetted, et cetera, et cetera. The self-direction coordinator also represents the fiscal intermediary at the life planning and circle of support meeting, as well as fair hearings or any other meeting of interest. Many times these coordinators have additional responsibilities, including monitoring utilization, facilitating CNBA for amendment processes for caseloads, vetting Medicaid and state reimbursable items through the self-direction budget, and other specific items needed by the circle of support or support given to the care manager and broker. In-house brokerage. Offering in-house brokerage, fiscal intermediaries are encouraged to have staff within that FI cross-trained and registered through Central Broker Registry to provide coverage as needed, as well as assist in maintaining corporate compliance oversight. This is different than what we are known to have as agency brokers. An in-house agency broker is employed by the FI and can be put in place rather quickly in the event that there's an unforeseen circumstance or an emergency that a family might be facing. If a broker does not respond timely or cannot be located, sometimes broker contracts with independents don't always work out as a structured relationship with a family. So that would give the fiscal intermediary the ability to intervene. It is recommended that fiscal intermediaries send multiple staff to these these broker trainings so that they can facilitate the process as needed. Support broker contracts. This is a contract between the fiscal intermediary and the independent support broker contractor. It ensures brokers understand the relationship between the fiscal intermediary and the independent contractor. It is separate and distinct from the support broker agreement, and it can protect the interests of both the support broker as well as the fiscal intermediary. It outlines protocols and expectations related to conduct and representation of the fiscal intermediary, and including things and elements such as activities on social media, relationships with other vendors, et cetera, ensuring that brokers submit paperwork, invoices in the time frame outlined by the contract for timely service payment. It outlines the expectations for that broker as well as the business practices within that relationship by the FI. It can also address issues like compensation, duration, frequency, and increment, helping independent contractors who are oftentimes freelancing, understanding that brokers are paid through a payroll schedule. It's not a cash and carry type of relationship. It will support your ability to reference and maintain completion of New York State OPWDD required reference checks and background screenings. Many fiscal intermediaries require that independent contractors carry workman's compensation coverage. It will support you when making sure that your brokers are meeting all of the OPWDD and Medicaid standards. Outlines the expectations for completing and submitting required service documentation, obtaining and reporting on development hours, subcontracting broker services if that's something brokers are entering into, and reporting of any malpractice claims filed against the contract. Researching IDGS. This is one of the largest categories of interest for many fiscal intermediaries, and how the IDGS is expected to be used and how it's expected to be vetted within each category prior to reimbursement in order to ensure activities meet standards for Medicaid billing and is remaining conflict-free. Researching IDGS items, specifically community classes and clinical non-direct, as reviewed in Module 2. Please do your best to memorize the IDGS chart and supplemental materials, vet community classes, and complete preliminary reviews of what is being requested prior to submission to the regional office for approval. This is to avoid excessive amendments and CMBAs in the future. And the strongest reminder is that the IDGS category as a whole is capitated at $32,000 annually. So it's important to keep track of the breakdown of how money will be used in community classes, memberships, transportation, etc. Things to consider when doing those vetting procedures within your community class category are, do the vendors provide services operated by any licensed clinical provider? Would that item perhaps be better categorized in another part of that in the other part of the IDGS? Is the vendor providing services that can be accomplished by a DSP? Is that duplicative or compatible? These are part of the vetting practices that you want to consider. Classes that are open to the public don't necessarily post limitations. They are generally not needing to be categorized as open to the public. Classes that are open to the public also generally don't say that they are self-direction approved or fiscal intermediary approved. Things to consider. Are these services duplicative in nature? For instance, would that yoga instructors also be co-providing art classes? Does it seem too broad-based? Is what you're vetting and looking to achieve actually subject-based per Medicaid criteria? These are things we want you to consider and hold on to closely. Hiring and training practices for self-hired staff. Hiring staff can be a lengthy process if you're not organized, and this onboarding process should be no different than any other hire process that the agency has, as there is no abbreviated standard for a self-hired model. Process should begin during budget development and not wait for final approval. Most circles of support are starting to identify and onboard their staff as that final budget is being sent to the regional office, so that fiscal intermediary is completing their background checks, they're getting their fingerprints completed, they're completing their intake paperwork with that new employee. So in order to make this process efficient, it's important to be organized. Oftentimes, fiscal intermediaries will ask that staff make appointments within their HR department to ensure that every item of that paperwork is completed thoroughly and that the packet is ready to move. In recent past, many of the fiscal intermediaries are using a virtual onboarding process, whatever works for the agencies and the family as well. It's something that can be supported. Encouraging proactive communication of your fiscal intermediary business practices. You want to explain upfront at the initial onboard as well as during the launch meeting what your business model is. What is the payroll schedule, reimbursements and requirements and timeframes, etc. These elements should be shared when onboarding new enrollees as well as at the launch meetings. That operating procedures, including fringe rates, salary caps, approval processes for reimbursements, onboarding and launch packets are consistently updated. For your self-hired staff, the participant is the managing employer and supervising employer, but the FI is the employer of record as that co-management model. So transparency is extremely important to ensure that effective communication with all members of the circle are relayed. We cannot stress this enough. Internal compliance. Know and follow the rules. Knowing the rules, memorizing your ADMs for your billing standards is the same thing as having an open book exam, really. You want to be able to routinely spot check for compliance and DPP monitoring per the most recent ADM that was reviewed in Module 2. And the website for the fiscal audit protocols that are publicly available is in this. This PowerPoint is being shared through your SOMS as well. Feel free to ask any questions as they come up. Overcoming challenges. Medication administration. The Nurse Practice Act is a very underutilized opportunity for fiscal intermediaries. I think that we've counted maybe only 2 FIs in the state have gotten received the con to pursue this operation, but to my knowledge, I don't think anyone has successfully implemented it yet. One of the major challenges in a successful self-direction plan is medication coverage for people who live outside of the family home or perhaps need assistance with medication throughout the day. The nursing ADM provides a comprehensive overview of this allowable service. In the provided attachment of the FI Broker WebEx that we presented on August 18th of 2016 in pages 9 through 23. If that is not still posted on the website, we can certainly get that to you. The nursing ADM is a separate application on your operating certificate as community delegated nursing, and it's approved by DQI to implement. So the process in which to initiate that would be to submit a letter of intent to the regional office to begin. Registered, in theory and in practice, registered nurses would be available to provide AMAP training to direct support staff working with self-directing individuals, and the service would be paid through the self-direction clinical non-direct item of IDGS. If there are any fiscal intermediaries in the group today that have successfully implemented this, please share that information to help others. 633.12. This is a process we want to do our best to avoid. It is a process used for provider-initiated changes, not circle of support-initiated changes. And in short, the fiscal intermediary has the ability to terminate a service, but there are requirements under Part 633.12 that need to be followed in this type of termination. Basically, there needs to be an attempt toward a resolution, i.e. finding another provider willing to serve the individual, and you must document your efforts. Fiscal intermediaries would need to provide notice, 14 days technically, and an opportunity to object under 633.12. You always want to ensure that you're providing an allowable Medicaid-funded service as per the current self-direction guidance, and this is to prevent 633 due process, where fiscal intermediary may initially reimburse for a service that does not adhere to the regulations, and then would have to initiate due process to undo that action. It's ultimately, once you give it, you may not take it away without due process. So we want to vet our IDGS resources to avoid conflict and having to continue to pay for something while due process takes place. You always want to include the regional field office in every part of due process for support and appropriate guidance if needed. As discussed in Module 2, best practice for checklists and onboarding participants, knowing what aspects of the service documentation will be tested and enact procedures to test for compliance, making sure that that published life plan translates to your service model, translates to your staff action plan, translates to your plan of protective oversight, your expenditure reports, and your verification of payments. All of those things must fall in line with each other in order to have a valid Medicaid claim and a usable and workable life plan that can be executed for the individual. Are there any questions we need to pause for in the chat?
Michelle, one question that just came in talked about the community class guidance you were sharing, and the question is, would writing open to the public or self-direction approved on a class website be an automatic disallowance or something that's a red flag or non-best practice? How would you advise on that?
What's interesting to me is that raises a very much raises a red flag, and sometimes vendors are looking forward to broadening their area of practice, so they might put on their website that is self-direction approved or fiscal intermediary approved. But the content and the quality of that class must be vetted by that fiscal intermediary. We're going to get into fiscal intermediary networking and information sharing as a primary resource, which is coming up next, for providers to develop a safety net for themselves with each other so that things that are true, legitimate, and Medicaid fundable can be supported, and that conflicts of interest can really be sorted out. So at the end of the day, if it's vetted by fiscal intermediaries and deemed to be an honest-to-goodness, true Medicaid reimbursable service, they can proceed. It would not be an immediate disallowance. I think we'd have to do a deeper dive in the content of what's truly happening. We're going to get into that a little bit further in the next section. Accessing our available resources. Who are your resources, guys? The first point of contact for anything you could possibly ever need is your regional field office. So you need to know who to call, when to call them, and what we're calling them for. Always want to connect with your regional office as your first point of request and intervention. Regional offices have streamlined all of their practices and procedures to more evenly address the needs of providers and service recipients through processes called regionalization and functional leadership. This ensures consistent practices across the regions as well as statewide. For example, in Region 4, any liaison in any borough can cover the needs or requirements or challenges of any constituent residing anywhere. You pick up the phone in Brooklyn, you can call the Bronx and receive the same standard of care, same quality of interaction, et cetera, et cetera. And these next slides are a reminder of our continued efforts to align practices across the state. We have formatted mailbox that were established in each region to streamline general inquiries related to self-direction, policy, and practice. And the next slides provide the email addresses and references to the counties that are served in each region. Any inquiries related to an individual's plan or budget can be directed to the liaison of record that can be found on the demographics page on the template for the assigned self-direction liaison. So each regional office has a designated self-direction mailbox. As you can see, it's Region 1 SD at OPW, Region 2 SD. They're all formatted. So anywhere in the state that you need to email for self-direction, it's going to be corresponding directly back to the region that you're looking at. In Region 1, we have 13 self-direction liaisons covering 17 counties. And as of June of 2021 in the OPWDD data book that is published on our website, I suggest you take a look at it for these metrics, were 4,315 people. So also for Region 2, it's our 14 liaisons are covering 20 counties. That's 4,268 at the end of June. In Region 3, 10 liaisons covering 18 counties at 4,089. Region 4, 13 liaisons covering 5 counties at 4,308. And last but not least, Region 5 has 7 liaisons covering 2 counties at 4,485. Remember, this data was as of the end of June of 2021, and our numbers have exceeded quite significantly. So we're talking about overcoming challenges, accessing our available resources. What are our best practices? Things that help the day run smoothly and fluidly and that translate evenly to the community in our service models. We want to make sure we know who our self-direction liaisons are. We want to make sure that we memorize and make good use of our administrative memoranda, known as ADMs. Keeping on our nightstands and memorizing the self-direction guidance for providers. Leaning on our central operations for billing resources and support, updated rate information, claims adjustments, etc., as we outlined in Module 1 and mentioned in Module 2. Former program checklists as a guide for processing. For many of the providers that have been around for a minute, there were these formatted checklists that were issued maybe back in 2008, 9, 10 that went over each element of criteria related to a self-directed service plan, launch meetings, et cetera, et cetera. It touched upon what waiver record requirements were needed for the provider to be contemporaneous and deliver. And you want to complete a thorough review as fiscal intermediaries of that self-directed service plan compared to the checklist before your regional office submission. And there's a link to a recorded training by Nicole Wixted in the SLMS for references to that. Making good use of the FI Broker Quarterly. This is very important. The FI Broker Quarterly is hosted by Central Office and addresses in a formatted way all of the hot topics, recent changes, and points of interest that are expressed on a statewide level from the fiscal intermediary perspective, from the constituent perspective, from the broker perspective. So it is critical, as well as for brokers who get their training, their annual training hours can be completed just by attending all of these WebExes each year. You want to sign up for these FI Broker Quarterlies in WebEx. There are links here, and you can use this as your page to register if you've not already. Again, it's strongly encouraged. And one of our last slides are fiscal intermediary networking. Fiscal intermediaries need to rely on the support of other fiscal intermediaries for assistance through many of these processes. These are networks where the OPWDD does not take a position or a lead in facilitating anything. We encourage you to be in communication with each other, especially fiscal intermediaries that work across multiple regions. You have many Region 3, 4, and 5 providers that operate services in Regions 3, 4, and 5. And many times brokers will express that there are inconsistencies between regions, between fiscal intermediaries, as well as what's happening in the communities. So we encourage you as providers to network with each other, stay connected, share resources, share information so that perhaps you can make determinations on what is considered an approvable or a disallowable service within the IDGS community classes, sharing information. If one provider has information about a specific community class that another provider might not have come across yet, that is very important to be shared because you're protecting each other from potential issues with Medicaid and billing. Chad, are there any questions in the chat that we need to look at?
You know, Michelle, there were a couple of good questions on IDGS community classes. I plugged them into our chat if you want to take a look there. Some people asking about best practices in vetting classes and also asking about classes that are geared towards socialization or recreation. I know you briefly touched on those, but I think it's a good idea to spend a little more time diving into that because we got some good questions there.
Okay, so the first question I see is that there are a lot of classes geared towards socialization, which does not necessarily meet the criteria for IDGS. And what should we do in this matter, being that a lot of socialization classes tend to lead toward recreational activities? And what is the best practice for vetting a class? Just to recap, purely recreational memberships are not allowed. Everything in the IDGS has to be related to a valued outcome, a goal, or a need identified in the life plan, and memberships must have an element of organizational belonging, remembering that community classes need to be subject-based, not broad-based. One of the pieces to that is working with your care coordinator and your circles of support to identify what is the true need related to the individual and how does it translate back into this community class or this opportunity. Sometimes what ends up happening is that what the family believes could be funded in one category might most appropriately be funded in another category. It's not a denial of service or access to a service, but we want to make sure that we're funding things appropriately. Are there any other questions? Someone asked for a printout of the slides. I think they were posted in the SLMS, so you might need to log into that to download the slides. The next section that we are going to be reviewing is Central Broker Registry and how it assists you in working with your brokers and how it is a resource to you when you're hitting challenges. And that next section will be delivered by Jason Shaney. Jason, are you ready to move on?
I am.
Great.
Everyone hear me okay? Good.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Jason Shaney. I oversee the Central Broker Authorization and Review, which I know a lot of us, we've all heard the term Central Broker Authorization and Review, and we're more focused or we're more familiar with the authorization aspect than the review aspect. We're going to talk about the review aspect today. So the review aspect is also addressed in the same ADM regarding the authorization of support brokers. What we do is that any complaints that an individual or a family or provider can be sent directly to the DDRO. They'll assist you with either providing a complaint form, or they'll be able to follow up without a complaint form if they decide that they're going to handle that internally at the regional level. But we do ask that you complete the complaint form just so that we have the available information and it's clear what the complaint being made is. The DDRO may decide to address the complaint at their level, or they may decide to elevate it to central office. Brokers can all, in addition to family members, can contact the DDRO liaisons directly regarding complaints. And brokers can also make complaints regarding other brokers if they're aware of service provisions that they find to be concerning, that they think that the regional office and or central office needs to be looped in on. Fiscal intermediaries may send their complaints directly to central office. And again, the complaint needs to identify clearly what the complaint is and what steps the agency has taken to resolve them. We also ask that any supporting documentation is also included when submitting. So this would be anything including emails are always valuable as far as documenting what your correspondence has been. Also, any plans, if the complaint involves that the plans are not up to spec with what's required, then we would also ask that those plans be attached. One thing I want to be clear, though, too, is that the authorization and review, or the review aspect, is not specifically for issues in which it's a broker who periodically has a late document or an inaccurate document. Those should be addressed internally with the fiscal intermediary. What this is for more pervasive issues. So if you've addressed, if we're discussing a situation with a poor document that's not up to spec, the first time we would understand that the FI addresses it. But if it's pervasive and it continues and doesn't improve after counseling or review, bring it to the broker's attention, then at that point it'd be appropriate to notify the fiscal, or to notify the regional office or central office as appropriate. So I review the complaint and decide whether additional information is needed, and how it satisfies and how the complaint fits in regarding our current regulations and guidance. If it's not within the scope of authorization and review, we may keep track of it or follow up with the FI for follow-up, and determine not to make additional response from central office. When appropriate, if it's something that involves Medicaid fraud or illegal behavior, we would make the appropriate recommendation either to Medicaid field office or OMIG, law enforcement, and or the Justice Center as appropriate. Internally, central office will consult with the regional office regarding resolution, regarding what the desired response is and how we can move to resolve it. While we're discussing whether the matter is within the scope of the program, we also want to remind fiscal intermediaries that support brokers are either an employee or a contractor, and you may have additional requirements for them, such as training that you expect them to follow. So if they're not following the training, if you have an issue, one thing that we see sometimes is that the agency works with a program such as a Vero, and the broker may not be knowledgeable of the program. You've exhausted your training, or you've asked them to take training again. It is appropriate to ask them to take training, and if they refuse, then you can take your appropriate steps. You just have to remember that it's clear to the individual receiving services, if you decide to end your relationship with the broker, that it's clear that you're ending the relationship with the broker and not terminating the service. This would work, again, where you want to consult with 633.12 to be clear that you're terminating the broker and not the broker service. Okay, to reiterate, we always evaluate the complaints with the regional office. And when appropriate, the regional office and central office will attempt to meet with the broker to discuss the matter, to get their perspective, and also discuss how we're going to resolve the issue. Sometimes this is a counseling situation where we're able to resolve it based on the counseling. But more frequently, it involves us asking the broker to retake parts of the broker training series. We may implement a limitation on their caseload. And when warranted, we would pursue either suspension or revocation. For our purposes, suspension is typically done when we're trying to direct the broker to either complete a task that they've been hesitant to. We've had some situations where either the fiscal intermediary and the regional offices thought that a document isn't up to par, or the broker is unable due to technological resources to complete the task. And at that point, we would set a time frame for them to complete, with the expectation that if they didn't complete by this time, that we would then pursue suspension. And the suspension would remove them from the public list. And as soon as they completed the task, we could then resume their authorization. Revocation tends to be reserved for particularly egregious situations. This is Medicaid fraud situations where we've had other situations where the broker is found to be falsifying documentation, signatures. In that case, if with evidence, we may move directly to revocation. We may also pursue revocation if we've had an issue that has been addressed in training and counseling multiple times, and yet it still is not improved. At that point, it might be appropriate to pursue revocation. The support broker authorization ADM was revised in August of 2021 to include due process. So what the due process is for a broker is that we may deny an initial authorization request if we have knowledge of something with the broker that would cause us to have hesitation regarding their ability to provide services. But more frequently, the due process falls into line when we're discussing suspension or revocation. And again, these situations, suspension or revocation, tend to come up when, due to repeated complaints of a similar nature that have been unable to be resolved otherwise. The due process involves a multi-stage appeal process. So after the broker is notified that they are revoked or suspended, they would then have 15 days to complete an appeal that they would submit to the self-direction redesign mailbox, outlining the evidence and any other documentation they feel may be necessary to prove that the complaint or the revocation was not appropriate. An internal team outside myself within self-direction will review that appeal and make a second determination that is issued in writing to the broker. If the revocation or suspension is overturned, the individual would be added back to the public list and continue as a broker. If upon that initial appeal, we found that we still had cause for concern and that the revocation and suspension was appropriate, there would be a second level of appeal, and this would be a appeal that the broker would make directly to the commissioner's office. The commissioner's delegate would then review the appeal and in consultation with the self-direction department, make a final determination. Once the final determination is issued, that's when we would notify the FI. When we decide that we're going to revoke or suspend a broker, we make a point of not notifying the FI until we've ensured that the broker has completed their due process. There have been situations where we've thought it was appropriate for the broker to be revoked, and then once the broker provided additional information and we came up with a plan with the broker, we overturned it. And so in that case, it would not be fair to the broker to have the FI notified. However, once it's determined that the broker has either exhausted their due process or it's clear that they are not going to file an appeal, at that point we would coordinate a date in line with the biweekly verification list and notify the FI of the suspension and or revocation. So in order for them to work with the regional office in assisting the individual in transferring to a new broker. After if a broker has been revoked, they may be apply for reauthorization or authorization again after a period of 1 year. At that time, they would be expected to reattend the initial training series and would have to apply for initial authorization again. However, please note, though, that as noted before, is that this could affect a situation in which, as we know, the due process now includes the ability to deny an initial authorization. So if we had a broker who was previously authorized, we revoked them, they waited a year, and then they applied again, we may decide, depending on the situation, that it's not in the best interest to revoke or to authorize this person to provide services again. Okay, and now we can just go through any questions that may be.
Jason, I think the only question that came through on CBAR has to do with broker accountability regarding fair notice and dropping cases. And I did write an answer in the chat, but I think it might be something that comes up frequently enough and is important enough to address verbally as well.
I would definitely agree that any time situation that we have, brokers should be giving advance notice when possible, that they are dropping a case, just so that the individual has ample time to find another broker. And again, the accountability is still there in that it may be appropriate at that time to file a complaint. We have had situations in which we've had brokers who end up just not, ending contact and not giving any advance notice. Sometimes they are going through the termination at least, but we've had other brokers who just have stopped contact. And again, in those situations, we would ask again that you file a formal complaint so that we're aware of it. We need to be aware of it in order for us to take action. And if it's a pervasive issue with a broker where they're routinely doing this, this is something we would want to address so that we can meet with the broker to address what the expectation is. Is there any possible opportunity for resolution, or is it a situation where the broker is left and we can remove them from our system?
There's another very good question about broker revocations and how that corresponds to other services, such as being a self-hired staff or providing community classes. Is that something you could speak to as well, Jason?
It would depend on if there's a conflict of interest. Part of this is that if a broker is providing a class and it's for individuals that they were previously providing brokerage for, then it's possible that they would have an undue influence over the individual to attend, and it would be a conflict of interest and would be maybe rejected by the regional office upon review. But again, this is one of those situations where you've got to refer to the IDGS ADM and standard with the current revisions or the new revisions that have gone through with the conflict of interest, but it is something that we see periodically.
Can you speak to the for a revocation, the time limit for reapplying to be a broker again?
I don't know that there would be a limit to if they were revoked. If we revoked their authorization, there would be a time limit as far as a year that they would have to wait to become a broker again. There wouldn't be a lapse as far as there's not a finite period as far as when they would have to apply for authorization again, because again, they're going through initial authorization, essentially. They're going to have to attend the broker classes and apply for broker authorization again, and they would be issued a new broker number. Part of that is because we don't want to give a false impression that as we do track the effective date of initial authorization on the biweekly verification list, we don't want to have somebody who's been not authorized for a year, especially due to cause, and then have that be represented as that they've been an existing broker in good standing for a significant period of time. I also see this when we're talking about somebody had lapsed with their reauthorization, and our interpretation, or my interpretation of the APM, has been that the broker has there's no set time for them to reauthorize. However, if it's a year has lapsed, then we ask them to reapply. They would not have to, providing their certificates are still accurate and haven't been replaced by an updated class. We would then ask them to reauthorize or to authorize again. Just again, because we don't want to have a extended period where they're not providing services, yet it appears that they've, based on the effective date, that they've been a long time broker.
There's another good question that came in, Jason, and I can take this one on regarding, can an FI coordinator who is trained as a broker, presumably an authorized broker, temporarily act as an in-house broker if the regular support broker is unavailable for, whether it be for revocation or whatever reason? And this has come up from time to time and hits on the idea of overlap between the FI role and the FI fee being billed for, and the support broker role and the support broker fee being billed for. So there is a clear standard that support brokers cannot provide other Medicaid services. However, Fiscal Intermediary is not an individual provided service, it's an agency provided service. However, you know, when you get to looking at this, it's really important that if you're going to utilize such a role, you're creating a barrier with any conflicts of interest. Generally, this would be expected to include an FI coordinator does not have the person on their caseload, is not acting in an FI capacity for the person who they are providing even temporary support brokerage to, assuming they're billing for that service, because that could be seen as a conflict of interest. It's also very important to be looking at the roles and responsibilities of both the FI agency and the support broker as a staff, essentially ensuring that where there is FI billing and support broker billing, that there is not support broker hours being billed for tasks that are actually the FI tasks and are being billed for and reimbursed as part of the FI service.
And I feel we have a question regarding whether a, just FIs don't see themselves as being the broker's employer. I understand that, but we would still expect, this is something as far as your standards that could be addressed in your contract with the broker. And I believe we had talked about this earlier or in module 2, just to clarify that there was a separation between the support broker agreement and the contract between the support broker and the FI. And we have a comment just about that just regarding the FI follow-up with the broker, and that sometimes it does get out of hand or very difficult when we're discussing independent brokers. And I understand that, and please just make sure that you're doing your diligence with keeping the regional office and or central office, depending on the severity, involved or aware of the situation. Even if you may have a situation that you see is isolated to your agency and you don't feel it's necessarily warrants a complaint, especially when we're talking about independent brokers who may provide, and many do provide services across a large number of different fiscal intermediaries. by making that complaint, or at least bring it to our attention, that we can see that these things maybe are percolating across the various FIs. So it may be an isolated incident in your FI just because you have one individual, but it may be occurring in other FIs as well. So if we are aware of that, then we can take a little bit more steps to address those issues. There's a question regarding whether it's possible to list the FI agency as an affiliated broker. Again, I think this touches on what Chad was just talking about, is that you have to be clear that you're not billing, that the FI is, that broker is not billing. So in that regard, we would not expect them to be as the backup broker. Any other questions, or I can pass the presentation back to Michelle.
So going through the chat or the Q&A a little bit further, there was someone posted a question about how much research is a fiscal intermediary responsible for when looking into classes. And the only real answer for that is all of it, all of it, all of it, all of it, to make sure that it falls in line with the self-direction guidance for providers as it communicates back to community classes. It meets the expectations, and that your red flags are avoided. You want to ensure that you identify what red flags are, and that is duplication of OPWDD and Medicaid services, duplication of community rehabilitation goals that could be supported by a direct support professional or DSP, clinical services provided through a community class does not seem to fit the criteria for billing, things that are listed as self-direction approved, FI approved, those raise some pretty significant red flags as well. They need to be broad-based, subject-based, things that would be of general interest, not necessarily of clinical nature that can be tied back to a PT, OT, or a speech valued outcome funded through the state plan, things that you want to look out for. Additionally, if the vendor is funded by OPWDD, that arrangement should be pursued through a direct provider purchase service model through that ADM that was recently released. You want to also make sure that the prices on the flyer or the literature that was provided to you match what's publicly available on that vendor's website, if the vendor has a website. Most vendors do have websites, and you have the right to feel suspicious about something that might not seem completely transparent or above board. Another item that was brought up were day-long programs that could, on the face of it, be seemingly duplicative of a Medicaid service, right? So anything that's exceeding just a few hours, you know, that's a full-day activity. If it's a full-day activity once, that seems to be more of a conference than a community class, and those things have to be approached differently. So yes, as the waiver provider of record and payer of service, all of these pieces need to be looked at. And if your research is indicating that you need to make a cold call or an unannounced visit, then yes, absolutely do that. Because at the end of the day, it's your billing that's going to need to be upheld by Medicaid. Another question was, can community class duration be more than 4 hours? Again, it depends on what the nature of this class is. Is it 4 hours? You know, what's the structure? What's the schedule? You need to use some critical thinking and discretion and judgment when making these decisions, because as we said, 633.12, once you begin to deliver, you can't undo it if you learn later. You can't undo it without a process if you learn later that it's inappropriate to bill to Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly vetting and researching these opportunities, if they're not readily known to you or obvious and apparent that they're supported through the IDGS, the more homework you complete, the better and the safer you are. There is a piece here on the question about social skills classes for children. Many of the family support contracts statewide offer social skills classes, as well as if this is a school-age child, then perhaps something through the district, through the education department can support the need. Not everything that is needed by an individual has to necessarily be funded through the plan. Some of these things are achievable through the state education system, some of them are achievable through family support, and some of them sometimes are not readily achievable. That's the reality too. So all things considered, when in doubt, call a friend, call a regional office, contact a local fiscal intermediary that might have experience with this vendor, et cetera, et cetera. Speaks again, more importantly, to the importance of networking as providers with each other, especially on a regional level. You know, this Region 5 has what they call the LIFI, Long Island Fiscal Intermediary Network. That is a group of providers that meet, I think, monthly at this point, that meet on a consistent and ongoing basis to review items and create agendas that address the needs of the regions that are currently being served by those providers. Regions 3, possibly 4, and no, Regions 5, possibly 4, and sometimes even 3. So these are things that on a statewide level you definitely want to consider. The last question I see is, can fiscal intermediaries get a list of things that can be approved by family support or Department of Education, et cetera? I don't know that such a list exists for that specifically, but family support grant lists are available on a regional level. So the family support unit in the regional offices can provide you with a list of providers as well as what they provide. Just about all of the questions we have. Do we want to give it another 5 minutes for people to enter in their burning questions? I also want to remind you before we break again to complete the attestation in the SLMS for this training. Chad, there's a question in the chat that's asking about reviewing the requirements for using the other than lines in OTPS. Do we have someone that's prepared to speak to that today?
Sure, Michelle, I can speak to that. So essentially, that is a category that can be used when the other OTPS tests are all met. So if it's something that increases the person's independence, increases their health or safety, is aligned with a valued outcome in their life plan, is not funded through any other available service, be that state plan, other public service or IDGS, or other OPWDD waiver services, and is not one of the excluded items, then that would belong in that category.
I see a question in there that talks about requests for items such as treadmills, bikes, pianos, and computers that can be reimbursed. There is a list in the IDG or the OTPS under excluded items, and many times that does review things that are considered supplies for a valued outcome. So, for instance, if I don't know, we're going to use the ice hockey reference. If someone's valued outcome is to be a hockey player, the state plan cannot cover the cleats and the supplies and the helmets, et cetera, for that activity. Although there are accommodations, I believe, for technology, for assistive communication, et cetera, but that should be pursued originally through the EMOD, VMOD, and assistive tech through your regional office by the care coordinator prior to looking to self-direction to fund. Okay, everyone, it seems as though the questions have stopped coming in. Thank you for attending Module 3 today. Please, before you sign off, complete the attestation in the SLMS to receive credit for today. If there are any other future questions, please feel free to reach out to any of your local regional offices as well as central office for those items. Thank you and have a great afternoon.